Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first ever virtual CyberTacos media panel. This is brought to you by the CyberTacos team and Inside the Media Minds host, Christine Blake. My name is Carrie Van Buskirk, and I do help coordinate the CyberTacos events. And we're so excited to have you all here today, even though it's not in our typical fashion, but we do plan to discuss the media's perspective of cybersecurity during the pandemic. There'll also be a chance to answer any questions at the end of the panel. So please drop any questions at any point in the Q&A form at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those at the end of discussion. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Christine, host of the Inside the Media Minds, to make some introductions.
Thanks, Carrie, and welcome everybody. We're so excited to see you all here today. We have a fantastic lineup of panelists to discuss some really interesting topics today. We have Naomi Ide from CIO Dive and the recently launched Cybersecurity Dive. We have Shannon Varva from CyberScoop, Megan Gates from Security Management, and Joe Euchel from SC Media. So thank you all so much. I know we're all very busy during this crazy time, but I really appreciate you all taking the time this afternoon to talk to us. I'm going to start, give it over to each of you for a quick background and introduction to yourself and your role right now. So Joe, why don't we start with you?
My name is Joe Euchel. I am a senior reporter for SC Media, where I've been for, a few months now. Sorry, it's hard to keep track of time now during the pandemic. Quarantine has kind of taken that away from me. But yeah, I'm a recent employee of SC Media. I cover politics and cybersecurity with an eye towards news CISOs could use. So, yeah.
Excellent. Megan.
Hi, Megan Gates. I'm senior editor with Security Management Magazine and also the editor-in-chief of our technology supplement, Security Technology. And I really focused on sort of the overlap between cybersecurity and physical security for our readership, which is primarily ASIS International members.
Excellent. Shannon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Bavra. I'm a reporter at CyberScoop, where I cover the NSA, Cyber Command, and cyber warfare. And I know that term sort of gets thrown around. And what I mean by that is sort of any geopolitical overlap between hacking and countries. So criminals, nation state activity, as well as some disinformation and targeting of vulnerable populations.
Excellent. And Naomi?
Hi, thanks for having me. My name's Naomi. I am the senior editor of CIO Dive and the soon to launch Cybersecurity Dive. First newsletter goes out on Monday. We're really focused on what IT decision makers need to know about security. And so our new publication will kind of look at things from an enterprise perspective, looking at enterprise security. So big topics are going to be what a CISO needs to know about.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much again. I'm going to kick it off with our first question. So as Joe alluded to earlier, I mean, 2020 has been a very historical year, to say the least. Everyone's getting adjusted to how we work in this environment today. So I'd like to ask, in a few sentences, describe your experience as a journalist in 2020. Shannon, why don't we start with you on this one?
You know, I think it has been an overwhelming year, at least from my perspective, but I do think that given all the turmoil, it's a chance to sort of refocus coverage on the humans behind the cybersecurity stories we're all writing. I think, especially on the beat covering the NSA and Cyber Command, it's really easy to get caught up thinking about what the DoD is doing and what China is doing and what Russia's doing, but it really does come down to, a lot of the stories this year have come down to, for us, is someone willing to click on a spear phishing link that looks like it actually contains valid information about coronavirus or coronavirus vaccine research? And just, I think things have felt just a little bit more personal this year for me.
Yeah. Megan, what about for you?
Yeah, kind of echoing what Shannon had said, you know, that sort of, you know, I noticed after I was in San Francisco at RSA, and then immediately sort of went to transitioning to working from home, and sort of this dynamic where most of my sources that I was also talking to also working from home. So sort of navigating that dynamic of, oh, I'm sorry, like my kids are here and they're loud, or, you know, my dog just ran into the room. It's really made it much more personal in a way. And I've gotten to get a better insight into, the people who are in these roles and sort of helping provide security during this incredibly stressful and dynamic time that we're living in. So, and also figuring out, I know for journalists, it's very, very hard to sort of unplug and step away from the computer. And, I've had to learn how to sort of create boundaries and be like, I'm signing off Twitter tonight. I'm not going to check my phone for like the next hour because everything is snowballing and the news cycle is so fast right now. So it's like making those breaks so that you step away and then you can come back and do your job even better has become just so critical.
Yeah, there's a lot to keep up with and effective.
Was that for me? Sorry. I think that if I don't even need I don't need a couple sentences. I just need one word. This year has been completely and utterly exhausting. It goes to what Megan was saying is like, we're here, our offices are our bedrooms. And so the dynamics that journalists thrive on are in-person contact often. And now we don't have that. But it's also indicative of what the news cycle is doing as well. A lot of stories that are being told right now are what X company did when the pandemic first hit. And it becomes a real challenge to tell new and engaging stories and things that add elements of uniqueness to the daily news cycle. And so while we have this, it's like drinking from a fire hose in terms of information and then making that relevant to your readers and really thinking, what does an executive need to know and what do they need to get from us in particular? This is particularly relevant when you have an election going on, when you have a social justice movement in the United States. And it's like, okay, what is our actual role? What is our sphere of influence? And what do we as journalists need to focus on? And so from an editor's perspective, it's a bit of a burden, but it also speaks to how the role can sometimes be quite fun.
Excellent. And then Joe, from you, and then we'll move on to the next question.
It's an interesting experience. I think you kind of have to have a dual understanding of how journalism works in order to during this time period, just because on the one hand, we see people in person less, but on the other hand, we see people face to face more. And so while there's this aspect of it where it feels like we are, being invited into people's homes multiple times a day, and we're getting that, and that feels a lot more personal. So much of what makes it into good journalism comes from, I guess what most practitioners would call hallway con, the group of people hanging out outside of the conference, just talking to each other, waiting for so much of it is just the idle chatter in between actual conversations that make up the good ideas for journalism. You lose a lot of human contact, and that's where a lot of the humanity of stories comes from. And at the same time, the entire threat model, the entire threat surface has changed. So everything we were writing about in 2019 is nothing that we are writing about right now. As somebody who covers primarily, a lot of stuff from the policy perspective, right now, policy isn't the most, government policy is not the most important thing. And it shouldn't be the most important thing. A lot of the efforts that went to national security are now being diverted to pandemic response, and that's probably good. Not for me, but for humans. So the change from covering what Congress is thinking to what CISOs are thinking about all of the threats that come out of somebody's bedroom, the IoT devices just lying around their work computers now. It's a very different threat space to be covering.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue into the next question is how have you each navigated the balance between COVID-related storylines and then other non-pandemic related storylines? I know there's a mesh and sort of a balance to strike in the middle of both. And you just alluded to it, Joe, with the IoT devices, but what is your take on that balance?
Starting with me?
Sure, go for it.
I think that for people who are covering, depending on your audience, if your audience is mostly practitioners, the balance has to shift with the balance of the practice. And so much more of it is now focused on work from home than anything that involved a perimeter before. It's a completely different space. And so I've tried to move along with it, and I think most reporters have tried to move along with it to cover the stuff that our audiences are now seeing, rather than the stuff that they were seeing 9 months ago or will be seeing 3 months from now.
Mm-hmm.
I can just jump in and say, excuse me, I think there's also an element of trepidation that I felt over the last several months to jump on pandemic news and sort of seem like I'm also being opportunistic about trying to get the latest headline or the latest SEO that's going to get people to really click, but that we do still have to cover it. And so trying to be really mindful about being sensitive to where people's minds are at every day. But also, not just with the pandemic, but also with protests against racism and police brutality, realizing that there's been a lot of really hard days for a lot of our community members. And we kind of sat down as an editorial team and said, we need to cover this somehow. So we talked to people about how racism impacts their jobs in cybersecurity and what it looks like in our community, that kind of thing. But again, that sort of feeling that we don't want to just jump on stories just because they're in the news, trying to be really mindful of that the last several months.
I think there's also this element of, we all know that we're in a pandemic right now. And so you find this editorial shift happening where at the beginning of the pandemic, all the headlines were pandemic causes X. And it was where we became it was where business was headed. It was where technology was headed, and everyone was dealing with it. Everyone was at home. We all had this thing that was happening to us. And now that has kind of lost relevance. We know that in every article, you're probably going to have a mention of the pandemic in some way because it is the new lens. But I think when you look at it from a story perspective, as you're telling stories and as you're identifying stories, it no longer needs to be your hook. Your hook should be a technology. Your hook should be a cybersecurity initiative or effort. It no longer needs to be the pandemic. Been there, done that. It's going to stick around for a while. And so I think just as we decide what stories are going to come to the fore, and as we decide to balance the election, and as it was mentioned, what was happening with racism in the United States, it calls on us journalists to really rethink what is the hook, what is that nut graph in our stories, and what should be the most important part we tell our readers.
Yeah, jumping on that, especially coming from a magazine where we plan in advance our sort of editorial calendar for the year and features that we're going to write about on specific topics, and obviously as the years progressed, looking at that and being like, okay, we still need to cover supply chain security and radicalization and all of these movements that we're seeing online, election security and things like that. So those are still our main stories, but obviously we have to adapt to the times and talk about how, COVID is impacting security professionals' abilities to carry out those missions and make sure that their organizations are safe, or talking about the civil unrest that we've seen in the United States and around the world, mass protests, and racism and things like that, and how all of these different conversations and all these elements coming together are impacting sort of the overall security landscape.
Mm-hmm. That's great insight. And another, question that we've had is, what sort of advice would you give to cybersecurity companies who are trying to set themselves apart during this challenging year, and what narrative should they be driving toward? I'd like to start that one.
I could start. I would say something is like drop the militarized language. And I think this happens a lot. A theme a couple of years ago was AI's influence on cybersecurity. And then now everything is already threats. Everything is always this like the nation state actors and how the bad guys can impact you. And so I think it's like being realistic about who is sometimes the biggest threat in an organization. It might be just like that sysadmin who's been on the job for a long time, or it could be a brand new person who has access to a system they shouldn't. And so I think if we rethink how you describe the adversary and the quote unquote adversary, like maybe you don't need something that's quite so stiff in terms of the language.
Shannon, what about for you? What do you think companies can do to separate themselves?
I agree with what Naomi said. And I also think that just generally, and this isn't just this year, cutting back on marketing jargon as much as possible is just very helpful for reporters. Like we're sifting through so many pitches, and a lot of them can seem like they don't fit into our beats if it's just marketing jargon. And especially this year with everything feeling so personal. That's just generally my advice.
Yeah. Joe?
I think that there's always a push to try to hook stories into hook pitches into what's going on in the broader context of the world. But so much of what's going on right now has been going on just continuously that I don't think it's appropriate it's as appropriate to keep. I received a pitch that was trying to compare certain threats to super spreader events. And that's not, you can go too far with something that's been a part of our lives for the last 6 months. You're not better off trying to adapt the narrative any more than you're adapting to the actual threats caused by that narrative. Mm-hmm. You're not better off trying to use COVID as a metaphor, social unrest as a metaphor, as you are. Everyone knows what you mean by work from home at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yep, makes sense. And sort of speaking from the work from home environment too, that's obviously a big thing that has shifted and changed. But what do you think COVID will forever change about the cybersecurity industry and hacking trends in general, besides working from home and that spread apart workforce? Megan, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, I think, and one thing that we saw sort of at the beginning, sort of in that March, April, May timeframe was sort of this increased vulnerability reporting and additional research that was coming out, just because people, honestly had more time because they were at home. And all of us need something to do to occupy ourselves, whether that's watching, too many hours of news series on HBO or
doing research.
Or doing research. So I think that that's something that, we're going to continue to see that just as more companies sort of create vulnerability disclosure programs. The government is definitely getting on board. They're required to roll those out as well. And so I think we're just going to continue to see a lot of really rich and robust research coming out from the community as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
I would also, sorry.
No, go for it.
Just jump in. I would also say, like, the perimeter has forever changed, and that's probably a very good thing. And so it was this, when the pandemic hit, how cliche could I be? It it forced us to rethink what is perimeter security in a way that technology had been going for a while. Like, that was the direction it was already headed. But then suddenly we had to really address that in real time. And you see this with VPN deployments, and you see this with laptop access, like all these things. And then even now there's news coming out that Twitter hack this summer was the result of compromising a VPN. And so it's all part of this larger picture, is like we were going towards a work from anywhere technology stack. Like that is where the technology was moving, and it caused us to do that in real time adoption. And so it will forever change how security programs are established. And like that elimination of the like actual firewall is a very good thing for how businesses should rethink their security programs going forward. And so it's been an acceleration in the modernization of how you should implement security. And it's going to be a major theme for us because people are still remote. I'm still remote until who knows when. And so those little attack vectors in which you need to look for in terms of what could be a risk, those are still going to be spread out. And so you have to rethink how you identify those threats.
I also think just something that I hope changes moving forward is we've known for a long time that cybersecurity in the health sector has lagged a little bit behind some other sectors, particularly in the financial sector, for instance. And I think just going back to that personal sort of exhausting feeling that I'm feeling this year, I think many of us are feeling, is seeing continuous news drops that there's another ransomware attack targeting a hospital, and potentially that someone died possibly for the first time because of a ransomware attack. It makes me hopeful that people are capable of thinking about not just privacy in the health sector, but also that sort of broader security front moving forward. I hope that helps everybody focus on that.
Naomi stole mine. As long as I've been covering cybersecurity, and I think probably well before that, people have tried to drill in the idea that there is no perimeter, that it's that's just sort of a metaphor that it's a metaphor that works for executives because you think of things as being like inside and outside, but it's not it's not an actual model of how security works. And I think that this kind of obliterates that metaphor because you don't have a physical site anymore, so you can't feel like there are things inside your site and outside of your site. I think that this might be one of those rare moments where people actually fully adapt to something. Most of the problems in cybersecurity have just sort of always been there in one form or another. They're not things that are radically new, and they're not things that people don't know how to handle if they, with elbow grease, gumption, and funding. This is one of those times where it seems like a fundamental understanding of how the architectures work might actually make its way into the boardroom as well, beyond the SOC.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think it's interesting to see how big of a shift this created, and it seems like it's sticking, and it will continue to create different mindsets about different types of technologies and the importance of security, no matter where you are, and regardless of the perimeter as well. So another question for you guys is, we look at how the mass view of news has shifted, especially as social media and upstart news sites have been blurring the line between opinion and actual reporting. How have you felt the changes of that shift in your part of the world and your publications? Anyone want to start on that one?
The weirdest story that cybersecurity reporters have to write regularly is the thing that just happened that wasn't a cyber attack. There's a tendency to believe that the worst, that's somewhat declined recently. Like, I can't remember the last time I had to do that, but the viral nature of claiming that like a simple BGP leak is actually like a nation state attack, or the power outage and power transformer exploding in New York is I don't know, Russia starting a very limited land attack in Brooklyn. it creates a scenario where we spend a lot of time debunking things that we shouldn't have to debunk. And I suppose that's probably true for anything, because rumors are really easy to start, and a lot of just living in the modern world is going to be trying to figure out if the thing the thing that was trending 15 minutes ago was actually still true now. But there's more of a fact-checking role than we used to have when we were able to check facts before publication.
Yeah, I will say that, this shift that we keep seeing has really, for us, made it very important to stress, what our editorial policies are, and editorial discretion, and being open and transparent with our readership about how we do the work that we do. Sometimes there's something lost in translation and people just don't understand how journalism works, and the difference between how a news story is put together versus an editorial. And so I think it's sort of placed the onus on journalists to be very transparent about, this is how, we put these stories together, and this is how we decide what should be included and what shouldn't, and having really good and thought-provoking conversations with people, who are sometimes critical of your work. You're not going to make everyone happy, but ideally that you can have a conversation where people understand, that what you wrote or what you put together was factual. They may not like it, but we're not in the universal popularity business.
One thing I would also say too is that we're coming fresh off of this New York Post story and a lot of questions circulating about information operations, influence operations, how they're impacting our elections. And I think that as journalists, editors and reporters alike, we have to be ruthless in questioning whether we're rooting for a story or whether we have multiple sources for information. And for our readers, if they can look at stories at our outlets and at others and say, does this reporter specify why a source can't be quoted on the record? Do they have more than one source? And then also as journalists, or at least from my perspective, I see sort of going back to what Joe was talking about, is looking at other journalists reporting and saying, can I poke holes in it? Can I corroborate it? Can I add something to the story? Because the more that we can add to ground truth, the more that we can sort of establish in the annals of history what is correct information. So, for example, the Washington Post recently reported that Cyber Command was running an operation to try and disrupt TrickBot. And we were able to confirm that at CyberScoop. And I think just having more outlets being able to report those kinds of scoops and that kind of information is really important right now. And not just in the cybersecurity space, not just with hacking, for all kinds of information that we're putting out there in the public.
I really think it emphasizes the need to slow down. And I think this is a concept we've talked a lot about in journalism. If you want to go back to your ethics courses, it's, do you want to be first or do you want to be right? And we should always be putting pressure on being right. And so for us, we run a newsletter once a day. We'll put news articles up throughout the day, but generally we have a go time. And for us, is a story actually ready to go? Does it need more sources? Is there more to the story that we're not telling and we're not getting at? And it's up to you, the editor, to say, no, this isn't there. This needs more. And especially when we get into things that relate to that are much more delicate stories. And I think that's many stories within cybersecurity, especially if we're talking about companies, especially if we're talking about vulnerabilities, especially if we're talking about people that could be potentially negatively impacted and or hurt, then we have to even more slow down, fact check, and verify. And it's not always fun as an editor to say, no, this isn't running. But it is something that I think we have to do, especially as that like disinformation creeps in. You have to know your audience and you have to know when something is really, truly ready.
Absolutely. It's a really good point. And then shifting a little bit, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but a lot of us are based in the DC area. And one of the strengths of this area is the in-person conferences, the breakfast, the lunches. With all of that off the table, has it changed the type of people you're using as resources that you're coming in contact with? How has it shaped the way that you're looking for resources and connecting with others?
There's just like so much less schmoozing, just generally on any given day. You usually have a reason to reach out to someone. I think Joe said this earlier, but it's we're seeing people so much more, like, but not in person. You're meeting as many people, and I do a lot of my interviews now. I accept them over Zoom, which is something I never would have done before. But I like to hang out with what are essentially my new friends. As far as like resources are concerned, I don't think it's changed, but I think we mentioned this earlier. It changes the type of conversation. And so I am still reaching out to my same PR people, or I'm still reaching out to the companies, or I'm still experiencing and getting pitches in the same way. How I respond to them might be a little bit different. It might be more casual. When you ask, are you okay? People will genuinely answer. And so I just think it's not so much changed how we communicate, it's changed what we communicate about.
Yeah, makes sense. You all are nodding in agreement. Anything else to add to that? Or I think she covered it pretty well.
I would also add that sort of sliding into people's DMs and asking with cold emails or cold LinkedIn messages has always been a part of the job. It just feels like we're doing a little more of that intrusive sort of random message, or at least I feel like I'm doing that a little more than normal, which is practicing that practice a little more.
Yeah, likewise. And I've also been surprised, that's been a pleasant development, at least in 2020, is, I found that people are more receptive when I just reach out to them coldly. And I've actually had a lot of people, I'll reach out, like, I'm looking to talk to somebody about this topic that I'm working on. And, sometimes they might not have time and will actually refer me to someone else that they think that I should talk to. And that is, super great and very helpful and very much appreciated. So.
Mm-hmm.
So many so much of what of the new ideas that I used to get came from going to see talks and read and see people present new research. And so many of my sources came from people who I knew from work they presented, that having that cut off is difficult in some ways, because it was, conferences were a way to be able to vet sources without actually having to, vet sources in bulk as they presented. You could get a sense of whether they knew what they were talking about, whether people in the audience thought they knew what they were talking about, and talk to people afterwards about. It's a great place to talk about people behind their backs, and sort of get a sense of whether they knew what they were talking about. It's harder to accept new sources now, I think, in some ways. I mean, it's easy to accept sources that with easy credentials, but it's harder in a community where so many people come from self-taught backgrounds who don't start with a lineage and establish themselves just through the work alone. It's so much harder to find those people now, because there's so much less of a way for them to get exposure. That's one of the things I sort of miss, is the ability to see a grad student's crazy geopolitical theory in the middle of in a 15-minute lightning talk, and either be able to say that's something great, or make fun of them to someone sitting next to me. Both of those are fine. So.
Well, I think we all hope to get back to some level of that in the near future. So let's jump into some Q&A. I think I've already seen some questions pop on in, but for the attendees out there, please ask your questions in the little Q&A box. And let's see, we already have a couple here. And if anyone, for the panelists, just feel free to jump in if you have something to say first to address it, and then we can kind of go from there. But let me see here. So have you noticed any trends that have increased with regard to government agencies and adapting to a more mobile workforce? Has anyone seen any trends that have increased with that from a government perspective?
I don't cover just government enough to like comment on the government related trend, but like as far as adapting to a more mobile workforce, I think we saw the like, it's basically the March, whatever, 13th light switch hit. We all of a sudden had to go remote and companies had to adopt different strategies within that. And so I think right now, we know that companies can now work remote for a long time. We know that agencies can do it. They've been doing it. They will continue to do it for the foreseeable future. I think the big pivot now is what becomes the long-term strategy, and what was quickly adopted in March, in April, and in June, and what do you need to do long-term. And so I don't see this creating like a policy change when it comes to how government agencies work and where they should operate. But I do see a level of adaptation both in private sector and public sector, and just in the flexibility. And so I think now that you know you can do it, the big focus has been on let's hone, implement, and really make more secure.
And for the government perspective, I think a lot of what I'm hearing from sources is sort of they're, moving to that 1 week on, 2 week off, rotating in and out kind of cycle of things, which just naturally dampens the national security community and the intelligence community's ability to collaborate live and that kind of thing. And I think, like Naomi says, it is a question still moving forward about how we adapt long-term to these changes, because the coronavirus, especially in the US, is not going away for now.
You sort of feel like bureaucracy has to happen in gigantic empty like warehouse rooms with with rows of desks with like bunches of people packed together typing on typewriters. There's a reason for that. That there's a lot there's a lot to gain from having people in a centralized location. But what I hear from people who are in the government, and this is purely anecdotal, is that they're working from home and expecting to return, but not at about the same rate as everyone else in society. So not a full, to incorporate more work from home. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've seen any specific statistics about it, and I don't think I've seen any long-term policy plans, but also some of that is going to be dependent on the coming election and a potential complete change of leadership on many of these agencies in the next few. There are dramatically different ways federal government can go starting 2 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's a good segue into our next question from Anonymous. How is covering election security amid the COVID-19 pandemic? Anything you find yourself doing differently than previous election years? Who wants to start with that one?
I think that there's more of a focus. I can't remember who said this first. I think it was CyberScoop. So I'm actually going to ruin whatever Shannon has to say, which is sorry.
Shannon, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, the data security, what we have treated as data security and election security, I think a lot of the people who've covered election security now know that we have to cover ballot security and mail-in voting in the exact same way, that mail-in voting security is an information security issue. So in the sense that COVID has expanded the ways that people input ballots to the system, in terms of expanded early voting, mail-in voting, all of the issues surrounding that, and all of the skepticism from one of the two major political parties. That is also an information security issue, even if it's a less digital one than the information security that we tend to cover normally.
Yeah, I would also say that just the way that we cover it, this goes back to not attending conferences live, for the safety of our family and friends and the cities we live in. I think we're all used to holding up our recorders and chasing down government officials and trying to hold them accountable live to get information about threats out to the American public about, if Russia is targeting election systems, or if there are active influence operations going on from China or Iran or what have you. That's been dampened for sure. That's been frustrating. But, sending in those email requests, phone, calling with sources, making sure we're, checking all the boxes, and really focusing more on that blend between cyber operations and influence operations has become so much more central to how we think about things. And not just from international perspective, but also from the domestic influence operations perspective and misinformation spreading around on social media. That's a huge part of coverage this year that I think, in 2016, we were just coming into being aware of alongside 2018 as well. It's really central this year.
Mm-hmm. Naomi or Megan, anything to add there?
I'm the lucky one who doesn't get to cover election security. So I leave that to the experts.
Yeah, I would say, and it's just been, this year especially emphasizes sort of the mix of, all of the cybersecurity elements that we've learned when it comes to protecting how we just run and manage elections in the United States since 2016. But then, it's been very fascinating to look at, all of the planning, all of the security work that everything that was going in place behind the scenes, leading up to the beginning of 2020. And there was all this emphasis on, making sure that people's systems were secure and doing monitoring and, sort of having a plan in place if there was sort of a DDoS attack or something like that. And now we've really seen sort of this new emphasis come out about just physical security related to elections, how to make sure that your polling places are doing social distancing and that ballots are handled appropriately and that people are being safe while they're taking part in this process. And again, with sort of also with all of the mailing of ballots and making sure that, that when I send my ballot in, if I put it in a Dropbox or if I mail it, that it actually gets to where it's supposed to go and that it is processed and that the person that I voted for, that is tallied correctly and appropriately. I feel like we're doing so much more reporting on just the basics of how an election works and then kind of working back from that to being like, what processes are in place to make sure that every step of that is as secure as it can be.
Absolutely. All right. The next question is, which storyline do you feel didn't get the coverage it deserved due to the dominance of the COVID pandemic, if there are any?
Does anyone even remember what the news was prior? Because I certainly don't. I think there's something tariffs, but I do think we've all kind of been awash in this sameness. And it's an element we talk about. It's exhausting, but I think the one thing we've learned about our news cycle generally is that we know how to overcover a story. So if there is just even a hint of something in one publication, another publication might pick up on another thread. And as Shannon was talking about, this actually can be a really good thing in cybersecurity because it can reaffirm the news cycle and what's happening. I think the challenge for us is to not just cover that. I guess this really speaks to what deserves more coverage and its follow-up. So I think a big thing that happens in our crazy news cycle is that we spend 2 seconds on stories that would in any other time take weeks to fully report out. And I think it's on us as journalists, especially as we're covering these cybersecurity topics, to really dig in a little bit deeper and provide that news and analysis to readers. It goes back to that idea of slowing down, but it also means that there might always be more to the story, or maybe there's not, and we can just move on. But I do think not letting things go it's hard. It's a hard lesson for people, but it is important.
I will say too, just remembering news before the pandemic really came to the U.S. In full force was the killing of Qasem Soleimani I do think that I can't remember off the top of my head who it was. There was a national security official who was speaking publicly about this. And I think someone in some webinar audience had asked a question about Iran, and they indicated, we still haven't seen that kind of retaliation from Iran for that killing. And sort of going back to what Naomi is saying is, have we done our due diligence and followed up on that properly? Maybe there's nothing to report, but there's so much news this year to keep up on day to day that maybe we've ignored. That's Storyline and others like it.
In some ways, it's not just coronavirus that has dominated the news cycle in ways that make it hard to focus on anything. We also have like a line of books about the president. So there's always one big thing that comes out of them, and then we just sort of ignore the rest of them because there's another book about to come out. There are tons and tons of. If you were to count up the number of things that happen in a given year, it feels like there are just more things in general this year than there have been in the past. There was a line in Bolton's book, and it was something that would confirm something that we sort of knew about, but didn't know was being really just seriously discussed behind the scenes, which was trading prosecutions with China for a better trade deal. So that could either have meant some of the. It doesn't specify. It could either have been the Huawei executive arrested in Canada, or which is when Trump mentioned that in public, but just in passing in the way that sometimes doesn't actually mean anything. Or it could have been any of the economic espionage people. But that's a substantial change to how our Department of Justice would be working. And I don't think anyone wrote a story about it. I think it just sort of happened and then went away. And there's probably a ton of that. And not just in cybersecurity or national security, but just everywhere. Because there's just an oppressive amount of information, and social media doesn't make that any easier, because it's an oppressive amount of information that there's just no pause. There just doesn't stop.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, our next question. So in the midst of all the COVID sameness that Naomi mentioned, what have been the most effective PR approaches to pitching stories post-COVID? Naomi, do you want to start with that one?
Oh yeah, I mean, I always say text me, but you also have to not just text me if you don't know me, but it goes back to like, let's actually establish a relationship. And I think some of my my best sources, or my best PR sources, are people who are willing to have like a normal conversation. We always say journalists are busy. That is not an understatement. And and again, it goes back to drink from a fire hose. Like the pitches that we're getting are also constant and not always correct for our readers. And so I ignore most. I read them, but I won't always respond. And that does not speak to you as PR professional. That speaks to me as busy. But the best way we can establish a relationship is I will let you know if I have a question. I will let you know if I need something. And if you have something you think is perfect for me, for my audience, and specifically that focus on audience, I think is important, because as you've already seen across this panel, each one of us is focused on something else. Like I have never touched an election story on our article because frankly, a CISO might be curious about that, but they don't need to come to us for that news. And so know your audience, know who you're pitching to, and establish actual rapport with that person and just ask them what they might be able to help you with. And so that's just a lesson generally. I'm sure my fellow panelists can affirm that.
Yeah, likewise, Naomi. That's a huge part for me going through my inboxes. Is this person familiar with the security management audience? And and based off of their initial pitch, I can usually immediately tell. And likewise, I do get a lot of pitches that I don't respond to, but sometimes I do, and especially if it's our first time working together, I'll try and be as direct about, oh, okay, this is like what I'm interested in, and this is what I would like, and developing that rapport. But it all goes back to understanding the audience and the readership. Security management, we are written for security professionals at sort of the executive and director level. So we're writing for practitioners, and that's the lens that we focus on. And so working with people who understand that that's the seat that I'm coming from whenever I look at a story and think about covering something, really goes a long way in sort of creating those relationships and that back and forth.
No, Joe?
I think a lot of it is still the same in that, as before, in that if you send the same pitch to 30 people, you'll get a lot less traction from all of them. Like if you don't understand the audience or the person you're writing to, you won't get very far with them. And reporters respond to different things just in general. I think I have more, the pitches that I have a problem with now, I'm not a problem with, but the pitches I turn down now, I turn them down for just about the same reason that I turned them down before. It's that the idea which is being pitched isn't actually something that's particularly new. Like I'd always think that the way to reach me would be to either tell me an experience that you had that no one else has had, or to tell me an idea that would surprise somebody with the same position in a different company. And the reasons that I'm not accepting things now are the same, somebody trying to tell me about zero trust for the first time as it was a year ago when somebody was trying to tell me about zero trust for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think all of my colleagues on this panel have put it very well. I would say generally for me, don't text and call me. I'll call you if I'm really trying to reach you and you've pitched me something and we haven't spoken about it yet. But usually, I like the way Naomi put it, my lack of response isn't reflective of you as a PR professional. It's usually just because our inboxes are overflowing. Mm-hmm. If you're pitching an exclusive, that will definitely get my attention, but I would also caution, make sure that it is actually an exclusive. I've been pitched exclusives in the last year that aren't actually exclusive, and that's been frustrating.
Yeah, that's a really good insight from all of you.
There's also a lesson in that. It's like, know the journalists and know what they want and how they want to be contacted. Shannon doesn't want to get texts, and it might be the only way you get a hold of me if you know me. And so just know who your person is and try to individualize it a lot, because otherwise nobody likes to be treated like everybody else. We want to be special.
Mm-hmm. Great insight. Those are really good takeaways, very valuable. So we have time for one more question before we wrap it up. So what is one story that you're interested in covering or covering at the moment? What is it that you're working on right now? I want to go around the room.
Well, I can go first. I'm wrapping up one story and moving on to another because we work very far in advance for the magazine schedule. So finalizing January 2021 story. It's very exciting to start about 2021. I recommend it. But looking at sort of facial recognition and privacy concerns, especially with what we've been seeing in Portland and San Francisco, and sort of some other legislation in the works, talking about how that technology is respecting privacy or if it's not. And then the other topic that I'm diving into for February is about hate crimes and groups that commit those. So I recently bought a new book, Culture Warlords, that I'm sort of nervous and excited to dive into and learn a little bit more about what's happening in that arena. So if you have any recommendations or any research that you want to push my way, please send me an email. So I'm compiling a lot of reports and briefs to go through in the next few weeks. So
sounds interesting. Joe, what about you? What's something that you're working on?
The FC Media has a large package of stories about women in cybersecurity that come out at the end of the month, and we're just finishing those up now. So a lot of my long-term projects are sort of coming to a close. Which is, I guess, a way of saying that most of my ideas are very long-term right now and not as solidified as, not at a point where they're worth sharing before I look silly.
All good.
For them not panning out.
Awesome. Shannon, what about you?
Yeah, sort of like Joe, for fear of bleeding my hand too soon on a couple of stories in the works. I would generally just say that the feelings that I have sort of occasionally covering hacking news and cybersecurity, when I also feel like the world is sort of crumbling around me, I'm still looking to cover more of that human element of cybersecurity, the ways that our phones can be turned against us, stalkerware. As painful as those stories can be, I also hope that we can all sort of make a difference in the community by covering vulnerable people who are being impacted by technologies in the way that others choose to abuse them.
I'll finish this off. So Cybersecurity Dive first newsletter goes out on Monday, which means we've been very busy. And so I think it's like starting out with the sexy, not sexy trends, which I think not only do they do well with audiences, but they're also interesting. And we're at a kind of that critical point of a year where you get to see where we've come from and what's next ahead of 2021. So look out for some trends coverage. And then we're doing a big look at what's happened with ransomware. So I have to give credit where credit's due. Our reporter, Samantha Schwartz, is just doing an incredibly deep dive into what's going on with ransomware, who it has hit, and what we can kind of expect. And so next week, I guess, sign up and tune in, and we will have some coverage on that.
Awesome. That's perfect. Well, how's that for timing? We're almost at 2:00. Thank you guys so much. This has been super informative. I really appreciate you all taking the time to talk to us today for our very first Cyber Tacos. I'll hand it back to Carrie to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. And thank you, everyone, for participating in the panel, and also to all our attendees. If you have any questions that did not get answered, feel free to email us at cybertacos@w2com.com, and we can pass them along to the panelists. And we are also hosting a limited giveaway for Cyber Tacos. So please tag us on Twitter at CyberTacos_ with the hashtag virtual Cyber Tacos with something you may have learned today, your favorite part of the panel, and you'll be entered for the chance to win. And for your reference, our email and Twitter name are in the chat, which is available to your right-hand side, so you can take a look there. Otherwise, stay tuned for some other upcoming Cyber Tacos virtual events, and we'll keep everybody updated. Thank you again for your time.